Good morning, Councillor Ball. We are live, but can I ask you to test your mic, please?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you, Councillor Ball.
Hi, everyone. Hello. It's 7 o'clock. So as it's 7 o'clock, and I think we've got everybody here that's supposed to be here in person, we will start the meeting. So apologies for absence and substitutions.
So today we have Councillor Paul Driscoll substituting for Councillor Polly Newstop. Councillor Binder Rai is substituting for Councillor Gareth Shaw. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. There are urgent matters, so no urgent matters are arising. Any declarations of interest from members? No. Okay, thank you. Matters to be considered in private. I haven't had any of those, so we don't have any matters to be considered in private. So the next part of the agenda is to agree the minutes of the last meeting, which was held on 22nd of March 2022. So have you all had time to read the minutes, and are you agreed that they are accurate? Agreed? Oh, okay, that was agreed. Okay, thank you. Okay, so obviously tonight's meeting you would have had the paperwork. So it's an update from the local development plan, and we have Steve Barton to kind of run through where we're at with the plan, and then also to talk about the kind of schedule of meetings going forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to focus on the public project plan, which is the local development scheme, which is the key appendix attached to your papers. What the local development scheme attempts to do is three things, essentially. Firstly, explain what the local plan is. It talks about the purpose of the local development scheme, and it provides a sort of short profile of each of the documents that we aim to produce as part of the local plan. So the first section describes what are local plans, and clearly, obviously, what they are is the plan for the future development of a local area drawn up by a local planning authority. And again, just to remind members, of course, for the purposes of Ealing, therefore excludes the area covered by Park Royal, North Acton, the OPDC, because that is a separate local planning authority with separate plan making functions. So the local plan will not be able to make planning policies for that area, although I will assure members that in drafting the local plan, we are obviously very concerned about the interrelationship between our local plan and theirs, and the need for effective coordination and cooperation, and that is to be covered in the draft plan. We cannot make planning policies for North Acton or for Park Royal. We operate within a national and regional framework. The national framework, of course, embodied by the National Planning Policy Framework, which was last updated in July 2021. I hear this week that the government is talking about further revisions to Mbpf. I won't speculate on what changes may come forward as a result of that, but we are expecting further revisions to take place in due course, and that's supported by a raft of planning guidance as well. And most significantly, uniquely amongst the regions of the United Kingdom, the regions of England, we have a spatial development strategy for London. So we operate in a two-tier system. So to reassure members, we're not operating in a vacuum in terms of local plan. We have almost 600 pages in the London plan, which members of the planning committee will be very, very familiar with, which was adopted in March of last year. And this sets the strategic framework for development in each of the London local planning authorities, and includes, very importantly, some important development quantums and metrics which we are required to meet. And our local plan must be in general conformity with the London plan. So we'll be expected to reflect the strategic objectives and the policies that are set in the London plan. That isn't to say that we can't depart from the London plan, but if we were to do so, we would have to have solid evidence for so doing. And a good example in terms of the local plan that we currently use is that the London plan did set back in the early 2010s very ambitious targets around energy efficiency. But in Ealing, we decided we wanted to do more, and we set higher, more challenging targets based on evidence that we had. And I hope that will be something which we'll be able to do again this time, by the way, in the draft local plan. So very, very important document, almost 600 pages. That is also supported by a raft, a very comprehensive raft of supplementary planning guidance. So that's the sort of context. There are also, just to draw your attention, a number of neighbourhood development plans in the area. We have two which have been adopted, one for the central Ealing area and one for West Ealing, and there are a couple of others which are still in very early stages of production, one in Acton and one in part of Ealing Common. So the document then goes on to describe how local plans are prepared, and figure 1 on page 5, I think, is a very neat summary. So where we are at the moment is very much at that first box of evidence gathering. And the next stage we want to get to is what we call Reg 18, which is where we will submit for public and stakeholder consultation our initial proposals. A very, very important fundamental stage in the process. So all the technical evidence that we've been gathering hitherto, and the members of the committee who've served on this panel in the previous cycle be aware of the raft of evidence that we were assembling. That's really, really important. But equally important is the views of the public and stakeholders. That's evidence as well, and that must be taken into account by councillors, and will be taken into account by the independent inspector when we get to examination stage when assessing a plan. And summarising very briefly, there would be at least one further round of consultation we call Reg 19, which is the final proposals. That round of consultation is more of a technical consultation. Prior to that, the council, probably through cabinet as your current delegated authority, would decide on the plan that you really want, the final version of the plan. And that plan would then be submitted to a further round of technical consultation. We will gather in that round of consultation any feedback or comments from stakeholders and from the public, but you would not be able to make any further changes to the plan. That plan, together with any representations made, would be submitted to the Secretary of State, who would appoint an independent inspector who, through an examination process, which will involve usually public hearings, would decide whether the plan was legally compliant and whether it was sound. Okay. Do you want to interrupt? Sorry, Councillor. Absolutely.
Councillor, can you speak through the chair and put your hand up? And also you need to turn your microphone on so that everybody else can hear you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the idea is that when there's natural kind of points through Steve's talking through stuff, and then we will allow questions. So it doesn't have to be right at the end, but I think that there are I think there's some natural stops throughout what he's talking about to allow for some questions at each stage.
So subject to the plan being assessed by the independent inspector, being found to be legally compliant and sound, it's then open to the full council to then adopt the plan. Okay, so that's some of the key stages. It's much more complicated than that, and I'm sure in subsequent meetings we'll get into some of the detail. Figure 2 just attempts to summarise where our local plan sits within the hierarchy of planning policy, with national policy at the top, the London plan, the documents that may constitute the local plan, and supplementary planning documents and neighbourhood plans sitting at the bottom of the pile. I think it's also just important just to emphasise that we have to work very closely with a number of statutory stakeholders, and that includes our neighbours. We have a very proud tradition going back 2 decades now of working with our neighbours in West London through the West London Alliance. And indeed, much of the evidence you've already seen and will see in the coming months has been produced on a joint basis with some of our neighbouring authorities. We're also a very active contributor to the Heathrow Strategic Planning Group, which has a different geography from the West London Alliance. It also includes neighbouring Hounslow, as well as a number of authorities on the fringes of London who are all impacted by the potential future expansion of the airport. And that group has produced its own joint spatial planning framework. And that was adopted, unfortunately, 1 month before the COVID pandemic began. And of course, as you know, the tin can, which is Heathrow expansion, at least for the moment, has been kicked down the road. So that strategy at the moment is in the process of being revised. The document then describes what is the current adopted local plan. And again, just to summarise very quickly, it is, of course, the London plan, as now republished, a collection of different development plan documents, a core strategy, a development sites DPD, a development management DPD, a joint West London waste plan, which I'll say more about later, and a planning for schools DPD. And the intention in terms of bringing forward new proposals for the local plan is to reconsolidate the local plan back into one overarching document, with the exception of planning for waste. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So where are we in terms of preparing the local plan? The eagle-eyed amongst you.
Sorry, I'm going to just stop you there for a second. I just wanted to check if any of the members want to ask any questions at this point.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll repeat that again. Sorry, we mentioned cooperating with neighbours, i.e. neighbouring boroughs. I just wanted to know where they are in terms of their timelines on the local development plans. Have they secured them? Are they through? I suspect they're further advanced than we are, because it couldn't be any further behind than we are at the moment. But just wanted to know, are we playing catch up with them? Are we looking at theirs and trying to adopt some of their thinking?
We certainly are looking to share good and best practice, not just with the neighbours, but with authorities further afield. And you may know, Councillor, that I chair the Planning Office Society's Spatial Plans Network, for example. So, you know, even on a national stage, we're always looking to celebrate good ideas and best practice. In terms of West London specifically, such as the nature of local plan making, they're all at different points in the process. Brent, for example, has only just recently, after a 2-year examination process, very convoluted, has just adopted its local plan. The OPDC has just adopted its local plan again after a number of interruptions and a change in the evidence base and representation of its final proposals at the direction of the inspector, because certain elements of their plan were not found to be sound. Hillingdon has an adopted local plan, but it certainly was adopted well before the current edition of the London plan. And they are now looking to revise and update, but they haven't got to Reg 18 and some way off from Reg 18. Harrow are in a similar position. They have an adopted local plan more recently than ours, but again, not reflecting the London plan. They will be looking to present new proposals in due course. As you know, they've also had a change in political administration, which may also have an impact in terms of the timetable and veracity of their programme. Hammersmith has an adopted plan. I think that's now 2 years old, again predating the London plan. Hounslow has an adopted local plan, again predates the London plan, and they're putting most of their effort into 2 area action plans, in particular for one for the west of the borough, which I think is about to be submitted if it hasn't already. So the neighbours are at different stages in terms of their trajectory, in terms of local plan. There are clearly obviously advantages in obviously updating earlier, but certainly officers were of the view that having an up-to-date London plan was absolutely essential to avoid abortive work or an early review. As I hopefully emphasised earlier, this is part of our local development plan. It is used on a day-to-day basis by your officers and by planning committee. And you'll see in terms of its development management content is very comprehensive. Some would argue more comprehensive than it should be. Certainly the view of the government minister who feels that the mayor has strayed into areas that perhaps were excessive. And there was a big debate, if you remember, at the time of the adoption of the London plan about whether or not some of these policies should survive. And some of those were indeed struck out by the inspector. I'm of the view that actually having clear development management policies that cover the whole of London is probably better than 34 local planning authorities all attempting to try and do the same thing. It saves in terms of costs. And the illustration of that is in the scale and size of our local development management policy document, which is easily the thinnest in London. And, you know, I celebrate that because there was no need to repeat what was in the London plan, absolutely no need. And that will be a process, an approach that we'll be seeking to adopt with your consent in this iteration of the new local plan. Okay, so hopefully that provides an answer to that question.
Yeah, okay, Councillor Driscoll.
Thanks, Chair. Just to go back to the point raised by Councillor Mahmood about the Regulation 18 and Regulation 19 consultations and the differences in there, because they're both labelled as consultations, but from just that brief outline, they have different roles, and I'm just wondering how those different roles are going to be communicated, so there's clarity when we are presenting consultation opportunities, and so the limitations of the consultations that are known. So how are we going to, as an authority, to do that?
We will have to explain that very, very carefully. Again, that's why I'm seeking to set that out right at the outset of the process, so there are no illusions. I'm not suggesting that Reg 19 as a consultation is unimportant or insignificant. It's very, very important. And indeed, the representations we receive at that stage will be very much the substance of the agenda of the examination in public that is presided over by that independent inspector. Okay. The point I was seeking to make earlier is the ability of the council to unilaterally make changes to the draft plan ceases at the point you agree your Reg 19 version and submit that for final consultation. I'm afraid at that point, the decision maker becomes the inspector who's appointed by the Secretary of State. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't influence that outcome, because it may well be, even at that late stage of the production, some further good ideas are presented by stakeholders, by developers, by members of the public. And the inspector is persuaded that the evidence that supports some of those suggestions should be incorporated in the main body of the plan. And we can certainly indicate to the inspector that we would be favourably disposed towards some of those propositions, okay? But clearly, obviously, the Reg 19 version is the version of the plan that we would like to, if we didn't have to go through that process, adopt ourselves, okay? That's the version of the plan we really, really want. Reg 18 is going to be a draft plan. And again, I'm sort of mixing up my presentation a bit here. You know, there will be some well thought out, very detailed policies, which are based on very careful and detailed evidence. There will be other policies where they will be less robust for various reasons, either because the evidence is still in formulation, or because we're seeking really to flush out views of stakeholders who haven't thus far perhaps come to the table in some of the informal bilateral discussions we might have had with some of the key stakeholders. Some of the national statutory bodies, for example, won't really get involved in plan making until you actually get to Reg 18. They haven't got the resources, they haven't got the staff, quite frankly. So you're not going to have a serious conversation about some of the detail until you actually put some propositions on the table. Okay. And there will be gaps in evidence. You know, for example, we don't have, and we won't have when we publish Reg 18, a detailed and comprehensive infrastructure delivery plan. Okay, that's essential, it's absolutely necessary, and that will inform the council's infrastructure delivery schedule, which is your local priorities for infrastructure to ensure that any future development that is built, provided, is genuinely sustainable. Okay. Now, in an ideal world, you probably have that information up front. I actually think there's a virtue in actually asking stakeholders, the public, local communities, what do you think the local priority should be? Now, I'll tell you now for free, the infrastructure delivery plan, you know, I've been involved in production of many of them over the years, will say these are what we assess to be the infrastructure needs of the borough for the local planning authority. And this is the funding that we think is likely to be available. Even when we introduce our own community infrastructure level, we are the only local planning authority in London which doesn't have one or isn't in the process of implementing one. It's a gap which we're obviously keen to fill. Even with a SIL, there will be a big funding gap between the aspirations and needs for infrastructure and what we can pay for. And so members will have a very difficult decision between Reg 18 and Reg 19 to decide where you're going to invest that money, that resource, from planning obligations or from whatever other sources can be cobbled together. And that's going to be a really difficult, really tough job. It's going to be a really important decision. Okay. But rather than just rely on technical evidence, which, as I say, will just tell you there's a big funding gap, what you also need, alongside your own assessment as members, is an assessment of those people on the ground about what they think local priorities should be. Okay. You know, you could spend a lot of money, millions of pounds, on building another bridge in Southall over the railway tracks. That will probably mean you wouldn't have an awful lot left for any other major infrastructure projects. Or you could spend 30, 40 million pounds on a whole slew of other projects. Those are sorts, I'm being really extreme in my exemplification there, but you're going to have to make decisions about what those priorities will be. SIL is going to give you an advantage over Section 106 insofar as Section 106 can obviously only be spent within close geographical proximity to a development site, because what you're effectively saying through 106 is this is a scheme you wouldn't grant planning permission for, because it doesn't meet all the various policy requirements. And what Section 106 is essentially doing is making up for those adverse impacts. Okay, so it can therefore only be spent usually in close geographical proximity to development. SIL is a bit of a game changer, because provided we go through the process correctly, you can establish certain borough-wide priorities, which means the money can be spent in different geographies. Okay, and I think one of the hallmarks of the plan that we're preparing now is that what we're saying is that no geographical community, no neighbourhood should be left behind. There were certain neighbourhoods in the last local plan which were deemed to be, for very good reasons perhaps at the time, based on the evidence, areas where we were not going to look for large-scale growth or inward investment, and therefore they were not able to share in the pieces of pie around planning obligations. Okay, so there's an opportunity for us to possibly rebalance that equation to ensure that development is more evenly spread across the borough, and the proceeds, the positive proceeds from development, the tax on development, can also then be shared in aspirational ways across the borough as well. Okay, so in answer to the question, there will be areas where we'll be very robust and very, very clear. This will be a genuine consultation, Reg 18, because we don't have all of the information, we don't have all of the answers, and we're going to be asking some very important questions of the community, of stakeholders, of you, in terms of what should go into the final version of the plan.
Thank you. Does that answer your, Councillor Mahmood? Just one last question, then we'll move on.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. So, good to know that, like you said to me, we have got opportunity to fine tune the plan from public consultation to Reg 19. But for the public consultation, is what format, what piece of format we are giving to the residents to get their opinion? Is it really it should be very friendly type of question? So I just wanted to know how you are making things easy for get consultant on that.
Okay, well, again, subject to you agreeing your work program, we're going to give you a sneak peek of our plans for the Reg 18 consultation and some of the methods that we plan to use. I'll just highlight one, if I may. You'll be aware of the excellent work that was done at the end of last year, beginning of this year, and the run up to local government elections, in fact, around shaping Ealing. And that was a game changer in my career as a planning policy officer. I can tell you there's not many local planning authorities that received the response that we got to that survey. Almost 11,000 responses were received, which is unprecedented. And that's been really valuable, really, really useful feedback, particularly in terms of beginning to indicate areas of challenge, but also local priorities. And hopefully many of those will be reflected in the draft plan that will be published as part of Reg 18. So you expect to see an electronic survey, which will be very comprehensive and will ask a range of very detailed questions encompassing the full scope of the draft plan, because we'll be wanting to get feedback from the various different stakeholders. So that would be one element. I mean, there'll also be all the usual traditional methods of consultation, public meetings, focus groups, etc., where we're wanting to try and bring communities together and get feedback. As I say, I don't want to get into detail of that now, because that's going to be a subject to you agreeing the work program of one of your future meetings. But there are some very detailed plans being prepared, which hopefully will satisfy your concern. If I may, I'll just move on then. So just thinking
Sorry,
about
Chair, could I ask a question, please?
Sorry.
Yeah, go for it. Sorry, I didn't see a hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I know it's difficult with only one person on. It's hard to spot it. It was about SIL. In previous years, when we asked why Ealing doesn't have SIL, we were told that we get more money out of developers via Section 106 than we would do by implementing a SIL. So it was a better way to not have one. But now Steve's expounding the advantages of SIL. So what's changed between them and now?
So if I gave the impression that SIL precludes Section 106, I was wrong to give you that impression. Section 106, I would expect to survive in some form, but I think I would be less honest if I said that SIL would obviously hoover up the bulk of planning obligation money that was likely to be provided. The difference between the two was what I was seeking to exemplify earlier. One has to be spent in most circumstances in very close proximity to the development proposal to mitigate adverse impacts caused by that development proposal. So for example, if you're building a housing development and it's close to a public transport node, you might want to seek improvements to the local train station, or improvements to the bus, or improvements to the highway. Similarly, you might want improvements to local amenity space, or some trees planted, etc. Okay, but that would be in close proximity to development. SIL is different as it's currently constituted, and would enable you, subject to you agreeing what your strategic priorities for the whole borough were, to spend money in different geographical locations. Okay, so that's the fundamental difference. In terms of whether one yields more money, that is a matter of opinion and debate. The major concern historically about SIL is the perceived impact it may have on getting significant contributions towards affordable housing. And of course, the rules on these ebb and flow. I think every year, for as long as there's been SIL, there have been changes to the regulations every year. I think in one year, we even had changes twice in one year. So the assessment of the impact and effectiveness of SIL has changed. My own personal and professional view is that I think SIL has the advantage of transparency, of openness, of being able to gather in money from a lot of smaller and medium-sized developments, which are not currently always captured efficiently and effectively through Section 106. There is an argument to say that if we're very savvy on some of the bigger developments, we can do better under Section 106. So I think part of the art of writing our future policies on planning obligations, as well as being clear about what our local priorities will be, is also being clear about what the relationship between Section 106 and SIL will be. And so, again, you know, just to be clear on this, we will be producing an overarching policy in the draft plan and a separate supplementary planning document which deals with legal agreements and planning obligations and deals with some of those matters in much more detail. But the important thing is the council establishes what its local priorities are. And I go back to the point that I made, and this was the same the last time we produced a local plan. It will be the same this time, possibly even more acute this time, given other spending pressures. The gap between our aspirations for infrastructure and need for infrastructure and the available resources, even with SIL, will be great. And so the dilemma will be, you know, faced with that context, you know, where do you spend those precious resources? What geographies on what items? You know, what areas? Okay.
John, does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks.
Okay.
So just in terms of the shape of the new draft plan, essentially there will be three key major components. There will be obviously a spatial strategy, very similar to the development strategy, that will clearly obviously reflect the strategic objectives the council has agreed in its council plan and the 9 priorities that have been established in the council plan. And that will set our overarching objectives for the local plan for the borough as a whole, reflecting how the various policies and objectives set in the London plan will be translated into action locally. The bulk of the plan, though, will consist of a series of town plans, 7 town plans, in fact, and their associated development sites. And in the final iteration of the plan, these are known as site allocations. These are those sites which we believe have development potential and which can, if they are brought forward and are successful and meet the various other criteria in the London plan and our own local plan, can deliver on the various metrics that are set out in the London plan and in our local plan. And so those will be familiar to you because those will obviously be, you know, the sites with the red line around, which you'll again be very familiar with if you sit on planning committee. A set of assumptions about the justification mix of uses, and in the final version, a set of design principles, uniquely, of course, reflecting the new policy in the London plan on tall buildings. It must also be clear about those sites that may be appropriate for taller elements in certain circumstances. We must indicate to be in accordance with London plan policies, those locations that may be appropriate. And then the last section, which I hinted at earlier, will be development management policies, which again, I'm anticipating will be a relatively thin section because the London plan already provides very comprehensive coverage. Then turning to the diagram on page 12, the eagle-eyed of you amongst you would have noticed perhaps that we are very close to publication of Reg 18 of our draft local plan. At the moment, I anticipate publication will be on the 16th of November. As I say, that's subject to a hell of a lot of work that's still being done in the background, and would run for 8 weeks, spanning Christmas, closing on the 11th of January. Those dates could slip slightly because we've got to meet a whole multitude of different deadlines: printing, design, setting up our shaping Ealing surveys, fixing the various consultation events, etc. We achieved, in fact, only yesterday, first text fix. So I'm a little bit more confident than I would have been perhaps if we had this meeting a couple of weeks ago. The document runs to many hundreds of pages already, so it's quite a substantial document, and we're now subjecting that to further testing and validation before packaging that up for the Reg 18 consultation. So the rest of the document then goes on to talk about supplementary planning documents. I won't dwell on that. It also talks about SIL. Just to add to what I said earlier, our proposals for SIL are that will be twin-tracked alongside the local plan. So we won't be publishing our draft charging schedule alongside Reg 18 because we're still gathering the evidence necessary to be able to determine the overall shape of any charging schedule, particularly around the IDP and schedule. I would anticipate that will probably be published alongside Reg 19. And again, in your work programme, we will be bringing forward a further development plan in terms of the detail of that and where we've got to, and explaining some of the work around the IDP in particular. Over the page on page 16, I do no more than list the range of evidence the local plan is built upon. So some of these items will be very familiar to you because you've heard reports from some of the evidence-based providers on how that has evolved and developed. And subject to your agreement on the work plan, you'll receive further updates, both on some of the work that was in the pipeline and new work that's been commissioned since your last meeting cycle. I'm particularly proud, just to highlight just one, of the work we did around the housing design guide and the characterization study, which has been an absolute fundamental building block. And again, with the agreement of members, we were able to publish the housing design guide over the summer. So it's already being used by our colleagues in development management and by members on the planning committee as really useful guidance on design in terms of the assessment of schemes that are going through TM. And so the latter part of the documents then set out the broad schedules for the different plans that we aim to produce. I think I've highlighted the key bits in relation to the local plan. I just wanted to finally just say a few words about the joint West London waste plan, which was adopted back in 2015. As I say, this was produced in conjunction with many of our West London neighbours. And there is a commitment from most of the West London authorities who were party to that to revise and update the waste plan. And there is a meeting of West London Alliance Environment Directors scheduled, I think it's for next month, to formally press the button on that. So we will hopefully in January be publishing our detailed timetable and plans for the production of the West London Waste Plan, subject then to each of the cooperating authorities agreeing to make a financial contribution to share the costs. It hasn't been determined who will be the project manager for that. Last time it was Hillingdon. There is a possibility that it might be Ealing, but I'm campaigning very strongly for it to be the OPDC because they've now recently adopted their local plan, so they have some spare capacity, but also because the biggest reservoir of industrial land in West London is, of course, Park Royal, and therefore a lot of waste arisings are attributed to that particular area. So it's really, really important that they are front and centre of any revised plan. So there is some logic in them PMing it, but that's a decision that will have to be made at West London level, and I'm hopeful that will be made before Christmas. So that's a very, very brief trot through the local development scheme. Happy to take any further questions.
Yeah, just opening that up. So we've got Councillor Mahmood, then Ray will.
Just two clarification. That's not really a question. One is when you say shaping Ealing and 11,000 residents participated in that. So what is our plan is that can we extract the related observation or recommendation and include in our local development plan? Are we doing that, or that's the question? Second is when you said SIL up, so my clarification, this levy, we will be liable as a local authority to take that levy and use collecting as a borough still for the local, for the low profile developments and other developments, which they will not be liable to pay section 106. So we will be collecting and we will be using that levy in the future.
So the answer to the second question is yes. But as I said before, obviously section 106 will continue to operate alongside SIL. The relationship has to be very clearly spelt out because obviously section 106, if we have a SIL, cannot be used in certain contexts and vice versa. So we need to spell out very, very clearly how those two mechanisms will work. But any SIL receipts we generate from an Ealing LPA SIL will be available for us to spend within the borough. Okay. In relation to shaping Ealing, I would urge you to look at paragraph 15.5 in the officers' report on page 13, the covering report, which has a link to the Shaping Ealing page. And you'll find if you follow that link, some very detailed reports setting out summaries of the findings of the survey. So I haven't brought copies of that with me today, but I would urge you to perhaps look at that, yourselves. In terms of how that impacts on the local plan, particularly in relation to the town plans, there will be sections of the plan which will set out some of the concerns that were raised by members of the public. And we'll set out some of those metrics, again, drawing from the reports that I've just referred to, and therefore setting up a discourse about, well, how do we then resolve some of those issues in policy and some of the measures we would take to address some of those issues. So that discourse will be very much part and parcel of the Reg 18 local plan.
Councillor Wall.
Sorry, I don't want to linger on SIL, but there's just a specific question on SIL actually. It's obviously, no, not obviously. So if we set out what our priorities are they set in stone until the next iteration of the local plan? Or can we change? I mean, you mentioned Southall, the bridge over in Southall, that became too expensive to carry on with. And if we'd set that and then we had a parcel of money, we just couldn't use it somewhere else. So you're shaking your head, so you've answered my question basically. So we can be flexible with that.
Absolutely. And
going forward.
Flexibility is one of the key tests of soundness when assessing the local plan. So we need to build a plan which enables us to be able to meet changing circumstances. And SIL and infrastructure in particular, that's not immune from that process. So I would expect you to review spending commitments and ambitions at least annually going forward. And so again, part of the SPD that I was referring to before would also set out all the governance arrangements in terms of how you do that. But you've got to start somewhere. So you need to set out what your overarching priorities are. In local planning terms, you need to be able to show that those are deliverable over the plan period. And as you've indicated, of course, circumstances change. I mean, one of the major problems we've had with producing an infrastructure delivery plan at the moment is the acute problems our colleagues at TfL have suffered. They've not known what their budget has been, in some cases, from one month to the next. So asking them to plan or make commitments over a period of 10 to 15 years has been nearly impossible. So, you have to build in flexibility. And so there will be annual monitoring at the very least, and that will be subject to whatever member level government structures you put in place.
Sorry, did you want to come back to
No,
that?
second question, sorry.
Okay, so second question from Councillor Wall, and then we've got Councillor Driscoll and Councillor Rye that want questions.
So I wasn't on the panel before today, so I haven't dug and looked at the statement of community involvement in terms of consultation. We're about to go out to consultation, and I'm sure you've heard this before, and it's probably been raised before, but it's about getting consultation to the hardest to reach groups, and the ones that are most affected by what we'll be doing in terms of that they may be living in it in the future, in terms of people that are on the housing waiting list, younger element, people that probably still just going to university or whatever, they'll be affected by it far more than some of us in this room. of the decisions we make. I just wondered how we're going to get to that. And it may already be in there. I don't know. So I'm just asking a naive question. So
That's a really, really good question. And I say, again, I would urge you to go and, as I did with Councillor Mahmood, look up the Shaping Ealing results. And that obviously the headline was we achieved 11,000 responses, which was, quite frankly, it was amazing. But what was even more important for me was we reached geographies that we hadn't reached before. We reached sections of the community, particularly young people, that we hadn't reached before. And for me, that was, really encouraging. And we need to build upon the success of using some of the new tools. I mean, part of the reason why we've embraced some of the digital tools is because obviously during COVID, it was very, very difficult to have face-to-face meetings, to have public meetings, to have workshops. We did have a series of other events and activities. I remember attending a whole series of events in Southall before Christmas, which we were hopeful would be better attended, but we had another bout of COVID and the attendance was quite slim. So being able to find other ways in which to be able to reach sections of the community was really, really important. The other advantage of using the Shaping Ealing the Built ID network was that we were also able to use a broader range of community languages. And again, that I think had a big impact in terms of the feedback that we got. Obviously, the challenge though was still around those people who are digitally non-enabled. So we mustn't forget those people as well. So that's why the traditional methods are going to be just as important as we go forward. Again, we weren't able to do some of that last time, in the informal consultation that we did, but that will be front and center of the work that we're planning for the Reg 18 process. You can always do more. We always strive to be better. But I think what we're trying to do is to use a variety of different mechanisms, both online and face-to-face. But the message that I was giving when I was able to tour groups before COVID was that also I don't want to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach either. I think there would be it's an arrogance of me to suggest the only way in which you can communicate is through X or through Y. So my challenge to some of the community groups that I met with was, look, you tell me what works best for you. If you want to have a meeting of your congregation or a meeting of your committee and invite somebody along, I'm happy to do so. If you want to have your own workshop, which we facilitate part of and then disappear, again, whatever works for yourselves, let us know. And providing we've got some notice, if we can help and assist, we're happy to do so. And I was quite grateful for some of the positive feedback we got to that approach. That's certainly something which I want to also establish as a key task as part of Reg 18.
Councillor Driscoll.
Yes, thank you. I'm looking through this list of evidence-based themes. And in terms of like our approach and commitment to climate change, because you mentioned about energy efficiency and Ealing going above and beyond, which is great news. But we are at the cusp of a transition from higher carbon to lower carbon ways of heating homes and use of heat pumps and other solar powered options. So I wonder how that's going to fit in with our local plan, because although we've got community development rules and national rules, how can we make Ealing more amenable to those kinds of changes? And I'm thinking they are on the horizon. That horizon's galloping towards us, price rises and so on. So what was expensive is now becoming actually quite competitive when we look at the price rises we have now. So this looks like a golden opportunity to also look forward and to tackle that head on now, rather than wait for any future time. I say that because I've had a very painful experience of trying to do an air source heat pump and looking at planning issues with that. So I know there's various rules, but what capacity do we have to make them more understandable, easier to apply, and what flexibility can we have with that as well?
Yeah. So I think there's three elements then in answering that question. Obviously, how does planning influence the outcome? Well, clearly, obviously, planning committee officers, we are dealing with applications for new development. And so we're obviously able to set standards for things like energy efficiency, for example. I'm sure this is a frustration that's shared by members of the committee as well, but too often developers will choose to pay the fine, if you like, rather than actually build genuinely sustainable developments because it's cheaper for them to do so. So what does that tell you? It tells me that we're not actually penalizing them enough. And so what we're gathering together, and I think that's the low carbon study that you've probably found on that list, is evidence to be able to justify. We've already jacked it up very significantly, as you know, a very significant increase in the penalty that would be paid by developers if they didn't meet the very stringent environmental standards that we want to set going forward. To encourage them as a first port of call to build generally energy efficient building. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing obviously is, of course, the bulk of the stock is existing, is old. So then you're into the territory of how can you retrofit. So obviously where we gather money from developers by way of that contribution, that can be used, and we've got a number of exemplary programs being developed now, actually working in practice, that can be used to obviously retrofit homes. We're doing that. We've got some schemes involving our own council homes where we're testing new technologies and implementing that on the ground. So I think that's another key element. And the third element is how can you simplify planning to enable those who want to, for example, put solar panels on their roofs, to make that process easier, more straightforward, less costly, less intrusive for the homeowner. But obviously that has to be balanced against obviously the impact in some cases adversely on neighbours, and that's always a balancing act. So I think we will be looking to bring forward further guidance on that last matter, probably not through the local plan, because these matters and these technologies change very, very quickly. So sitting beneath the local plan, I'm also envisaging we'll produce a raft of what we're calling local planning policy guidance, mirrored on the national planning policy guidance. You've already seen an illustration of that over the summer when we produce guidance on tall buildings, for example. So it's a way for us to be able to provide guidance on design matters, for example, more quickly, more easily, and providing they fit in with our overall strategy set out in the local plan or the London plan, that's perfectly acceptable.
I'm just thinking of the time scaling this. If it doesn't come in this local plan and we're looking at some supplementary documents, how long will the wait be for something that gives greater clarity or encouragement or flexibility? And I think given that most of our stock is existing homes, so I think there is a need to sort of move quicker on this aspect.
I mean, obviously retrofitting is happening, but it's probably a drop in the ocean compared to the overall need, because obviously the resource available and the scale of the challenge is enormous. So at the moment it's about exemplification and it's making gestures, and where we are able to seeking those upgrades and improvements when there are refurbishments and so forth. So I think that is happening already. It doesn't need the local plan for us to do that necessarily, although the local plan can provide a further stimulus and catalyst. In terms of new developments, it's a very perceptive question, actually, because the debate that I and my team have been having is, should you set the rates, the penalties that might apply in the local plan, or should it sit outside the local plan? I'm firmly of the view you should set out the principles in the local plan, but actually what that rate should be needs to be kept updated and needs to be updated on the basis of available evidence. So we would keep that outside the local plan. So it could mean, subject to the evidence being there to support it, that we could seek to implement some of those measures earlier than adoption of the local plan. We have already set a precedent for doing that, because as Councillor Wall will testify, the rates have been massively increased over the last 12, 18 months. I think there's an awful lot more headroom though.
Councillor Wright.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Right. I think Councillor Wall asked the question that I was going to ask on consultation. And I think the officer has answered it very thoroughly. However, I would just like to pick up on one thing that I didn't hear, and that is what sort of approach are we going to take towards consulting the elderly in the borough as well? Because I think that's really important. And, you know, you've already talked about the young people. And what else are you going to be doing to try and get through to people? I'm thinking about the local Southall community, for example, and you have certain networks that you consult through. But are we taking extra measures to consult with people on the ground? You know, who, yeah, other than, I'm trying to be very polite here. I think if we can get through to people that we wouldn't normally get through to through those groups, it would be really fantastic. So covering them, covering the elderly. And I'd also congratulate you on the 11,000 response. I think that's fantastic. I don't think we've ever had a response like that in Ealing before. So I feel very confident that the next stage will be really excellent and we'll get some good feedback.
I'm grateful for that feedback. I mean, clearly, obviously, the Shaping Ealing experience was an opportunity for us to innovate and to experiment. And I think we learned a lot. I think there were some things we got just right. There were some things which actually we could do better. We've seen that as a massive learning experience. It's still not a substitute, though, for face-to-face contact, for having those conversations, because the surveys will reach an audience that you wouldn't otherwise reach. I have to say, particularly with the young, when you're using social media as your push and pull mechanism for trying to reach out. But clearly, obviously, it's not a substitute for actually having that sort of detailed conversation. And so, as I say, by making contact with some of the key amenity and other residents groups in the borough, community groups in the borough, what we've been trying to establish is what would work best in different geographies. I think a one-size-fits-all approach is destined to fail. And I think that's one of the reasons why we were able to get much better figures. I mean, it still doesn't fully reflect, in my opinion, the relative populations of the different neighbourhoods, but far more reflective than we've ever achieved before. Okay, so it's good, but I think we can do better.
Sorry, and I've got a question as well. So just on, because obviously you focused, and some of the questions have been focused around that engagement side of things, and the fact that we did get a great response from the consultation. What we're doing in order to advertise that, and how well we're working with the comms team and kind of events and community engagement teams, because I think that will be like a massively important role, that, and you know, not ticking a box, oh, we did a Facebook post, but actually, you know, a really robust thing, you know, going forward, comms plan going forward.
Good evening, councillors. My name's Jeanette Walsh. I'm working with Steve and the strategic policy team with programming on the local plan. And one of the areas, first thing to say in relation to engagement, is that there'll be a full presentation on the 13th of October about the engagement strategy. So we'll be running through with you what the engagement strategy is. Also, just to reassure you, we're currently putting a communication strategy together with our internal comms team. There's been a huge amount of internal consultation to ensure that we do cover off all of the underserved communities in particular, as well as other areas, other communities as well. So we'll have a full presentation for you, and we can go through in detail with you what we're planning. And if we're actually as far on as I hope we will be, we should be able to actually give you the list of what we're doing, when, where, why, and how. So hopefully you'll have that quite soon. We also have a senior engagement officer that's been brought onto the team to actually work with the strategic policy team so that we approach this consultation in a fairly innovative and different way.
Okay, I've got a question from Councillor Ball. We didn't ignore you this time.
Great, thanks very much, Chair. Yeah, so we've touched on Shaping Ealing. I guess, I mean, I agree with others that it's absolutely fantastic. We've had 11,000 responses, but how is the feedback loop working so that those responses genuinely feed in to the plan going forward? I mean, so the kind of the key things that people are unhappy with in Ealing Town and borough wide are that a lot more people disagree than agree, that they're happy with the way the area is changing, and people want more affordable housing. So, you know, are there going to be changes grounded in those responses compared to what officers were intending to put in there prior to the responses coming in?
So just to say, I think that's a similar question to the Councillor Tariq Mahmood. But if you want to expand on some of the detail, that'd be.
I turned it off. So yeah, yes is the straightforward answer. I mean, you will see in the structure of the Reg 18 plan when published that we will make reference to some of the feedback and findings we got from the Shaping Ealing survey. So some of those metrics will be reproduced. As I say, they're already available in the reports that I referenced earlier. And then we'll then go on to show how we then try to address some of those in the local plan. And what I'm trying to avoid to sort of get into a lot of the detail, but I feel I should just stress one point. What was very interesting about the survey was when you started to look at the survey results across the different neighbourhoods, you got some very, very different conclusions being drawn. So, for example, it perhaps will be no shock or surprise that, you know, one of the high-rated scores was that people generally regarded public transport connectivity in the borough to be generally very good. That ended up being on the top end of the spectrum in terms of positive responses. But the responses weren't uniform across all geographies. And there were some geographies, Northolt in particular, whilst more than 50% of the respondents said, you know, they were good or satisfactory, that was lower than the borough average and was lower than the percentages that were achieved in other geographies. So it should be no surprise to you, therefore, that amongst the conclusions in the policy that we draw are the need for better connectivity, both in terms of active travel components, but also in terms of public transport, buses and the like, to ensure that, you know, that there is a real change on the ground in terms of connectivity, and the perception that Northolt, you know, does not have the same sort of levels of public transport accessibility that perhaps they were enjoyed in central Ealing, for example. So that's, you know, a really compelling example of how the feedback that we were getting from Shaping Ealing quite deliberately impacted on the policy programs that were being suggested.
Okay, I think we've got a last question from Councillor Wall.
Sorry, I just want to move on from consultation. Although I'd like to note that 11,000 respondents is about the same amount of people we've got on the housing waiting list as well. So I thought I'd throw that one in. Just on viability of development, are we looking at that, Steve? Because it is an irksome thing for a lot of people in the planning committee and wider, I'm sure. But we were always given a figure, etc., and we have to stick with it. And, you know, your gut feel says there's probably more in that development, but that's where it is. But I just, and with the kind of cost of living issues going on now, viability is getting less and less in terms of where we are. I just wondered how we'd address this, or is it part of this local plan?
It's a key component, and we haven't done the relevant bit of evidence on viability yet, because it's almost one of the last things I want to do, because otherwise we face the prospect of serious amounts of abortive and very expensive work. But one of the things that we will have to do is to subject the entire local plan to viability testing. And this will be very important in terms of, you know, meeting tests of soundness when we get to the examination. The draft local plan that we plan to publish will include a range of development sites, for example. Not all of those will survive the cut for Reg 19, so we don't want to viability test all of those. Similarly, some of the planning policies that we're developing are still in formative stages. We're actually going to be asking genuine questions and asking for genuine feedback, because there are options. Just to give one example, because it's referenced in the London plan, so I'm not giving too much of a sneak peek here. One of the commitments in the London plan is around urban greening. Again, very important in the council plan. You've got some very ambitious plans in terms of the number of new parks you want to develop, the amount of rewilding you want to do, and the improvements you want to make in the borough around biodiversity. The London plan, unfortunately, one of its weaknesses was, whilst it suggests a policy on urban greening, suggests a threshold, but only as an interim. It leaves it up to boroughs to decide what thresholds we should set. And I want us to be more ambitious. I share the council plan objectives. I want us to be more innovative, and I want to set a higher threshold. We are in the process of gathering the evidence that might justify that approach. Brent decided to stick. They've adopted the interim advice. They've done no more. So one of the questions we'll ask is, should we stick with what the London plan suggests, or should we go for a higher threshold, as I would heartily recommend? And, part of my job will be to try and justify the evidence to be able to enable us to do that in a sound and efficient way, so that, we're not then challenged on decisions that appeal, for example.
Okay, so we don't have any speakers for this meeting, but we have been contacted at quite a late stage from a resident who wants to talk about the local development plan. So we'll read out that statement on his behalf. Okay, so this was submitted by Will French, Chair of Save Ealing Centre. As the report says, the local plan is an essential document laying out a pathway for the borough's growth. It's one of the most important areas of responsibility for the council, and making basically local development, a key committee. So first, I want to wish the new committee well as it picks up the reins. You've got lots to do. You're reviewing the local plan approved in 2012, so it's 10 years old. It's not just the plan itself. Ealing lags behind other London boroughs in the production of almost every other document going into it. This is very serious for our borough. Out-of-date plans create a vacuum that allows speculative developers to make bigger profits by threatening costly appeals with adverse cost decisions, if they don't get what they want. Obsolete plans help no one in Ealing. As most of you know, there's a groundswell of anger amongst communities from Southall to Acton, from Greenford to Ealing, worried about how their areas are changing through the proliferation of large towers to provide speculative homes unsuited for the needs of local people, while so much of the essential infrastructure, e.g. open space, community centres and transport links can't keep pace. Recently, there has been news about the electricity supply. Developments in Acton are stalling because of insufficient water supply. The unhappiness strains the ability of the council to manage all the proposals flooding in. Schemes seem to enjoy less and less professional input on the part of planners, and committees seem to do little more than rubber stamp the schemes brought to them. As Councillor Mason will tell you, I was an enthusiast of his 2018 relaunched local development policy committee, and I address some, particularly the town centres, an area I have long been concerned about, the chair of SEC. So it's been a huge disappointment of how little those 4 years meetings have made. I'm sorry, I just need to move this down. Are we up to 3 minutes yet? Yeah, so thank you. Oh, there we go, thanks. We were told then our new plan would pass through its necessary stages and would be adopted by December 2020. It's not clear why things have slipped ever since. Now we read the deadline as 2024. Perhaps one reason for the delay is the apprehension that the launch of the debate will lead to more rows with the local communities. What I want to say now is simple. Let's get on with things. If we have rows, let's grasp the nettle and do so. It's far better working this way, that for everyone in the borough to grow more disturbed with the way things are heading, but feel equally helpless in shaping them. I promised I'd read it out. So it was good. Hmm? Oh, probably not, but right. So moving on from that, we basically need to make a decision tonight. So recommendations are for us to agree the proposed draft meetings program for the future LDB, basically how do I say it? LDPAC. I'm trying to do the colloquialisms of Ealing Council meetings set out in Appendix A, subject to any amendments by the advisory committee. And then just worth noting is around the contents of this report, including Appendix C, which sets out a revised public project plan for the production of the new local plan for Ealing LPA. So, yeah, so is that agreed? Yeah. Thank you. And does that include, just checking online, are you in agreement? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
I would be in agreement, but I'm not allowed to vote.
Yes, sorry, I forgot about that. Yeah.
And finally.
Oh, yeah, sure. So the date of the next meeting will be taking place on the 13th of October 2022. So we look forward to getting some more detail as Jeanette Walsh mentioned around the kind of community engagement and the communications. Thank you. Yeah, Steve just wants to say one thing.
Just wanted to add one thing on the work programme. Difference between the last cycle of meetings, for those of you on it, and this cycle of meetings is that this time you will have very soon some draft policies. So you won't just be grappling with the evidence, you'll actually be able to give real feedback on some of the drafts, the aspirations that are set out in the draft plan. So what I'm hoping the committee will do through the chair is obviously provide us, my team, with feedback on some of the draft policies that have been prepared, so that we can enable that to then be assembled as part of the feedback that will go back to the cabinet portfolio holder when obviously the council approves the Reg 19 version of the plan. So this is the most important committee for members to input in terms of the details of the local plan. So you will get lots of presentations on the evidence and updates on that, and you'll have an opportunity to interrogate the authors of those reports, and indeed members of my team have tried to reflect that in terms of policy. But we will be very grateful to hear, the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of where we got to, where the gaps are, what things you would like to see clarified in the local plan. So I think you will find it a much more productive process than perhaps you might have in the previous cycle where you had no draft policies in front of you.
I was going to end the meeting, but Councillor Wall.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I just can we not have death by PowerPoint?
Yeah.
And B, can we give strict time limits on presentations rather than lots of presentations, then no room for debate and discussion at the end. Yeah.
No, that's noted, and we will work together with Jack and also Steve to make sure that that agenda is robust and also gives opportunity for not only guest speakers so that we can get different points of view, but also to robustly kind of question and interrogate. Thank you. So if we've got no further questions, then we'll end tonight's meeting. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you all on the 13th of October.
Good night.